Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Kyo Kim. As the 76th session of the UN General Assembly is taking place in New York, the UN Security Council held an emergency meeting on North Korea's recent missile tests, which the regime criticized, saying the council applied double standards. And the UN panel of experts said in its latest regular report, North Korea continues to evade sanctions and advance its nuclear and missile programs. Today we'll discuss these and more. Joining me is Mitchell Reiss. Ambassador Reiss was Director of Policy Planning at the United States Department of State, reporting directly to then Secretary Colin Powell. He also served at the White House National Security Council. Scott Snyder is also with me today. Mr. Snyder is Director of the U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, South Korea at the Crossroads, examines the trajectory of South Korean foreign policy. Welcome. Great to have you both.
Thank you, Young-Kyo.
Thank you.
At the United Nations, North Korea is one of the hot topics being discussed. The UN Security Council held an emergency meeting with doors closed. The meeting was requested by the US, France, and the UK, a day after the North Korea regime test-fired its newly developed anti-aircraft missile. Ambassador Reiss, do you think the countries requesting the meeting immediately shows North Korea's missile tests are taken seriously?
I think that's exactly what it shows, certainly by the three countries that requested the meeting. But it's unfortunate that they were unable to build a consensus with Russia and China so that any action could actually be taken.
Mr. Snyder, is the North Korean issue being seen as more of an urgent issue compared to the past?
No, I think the urgency is the same. Maybe what it shows is the Biden administration is showing a little bit less tolerance than the Trump administration did, especially post-summit. Because what I noticed from this is that in prior cases during the Trump administration, the U.S. was not calling for the meeting. It was just the European countries. But with the Biden administration, the U.S. has rejoined the call for meetings following these kinds of tests.
North Korea fired a series of missiles, one of which is claimed to be hypersonic. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said North Korea has violated the UN Security Council resolutions. However, as Ambassador said earlier, the UN Security Council, in the end, failed to reach an agreement on issuing a joint statement on North Korea's latest missile tests. Mr. Snyder, what do you think has occurred?
Well, I think it really just shows the return of geopolitics to the Security Council. And it underscores the failure to reach consensus that really emerged at the very end of the Trump administration, at least on the North Korea issue. We also know that the panel of experts, there are reports that that body is also being divided and essentially neutralized by geopolitical differences and lack of cooperation among representatives, including from China.
Ambassador, you mentioned China and Russia earlier. Do you think they were behind the failure of reaching an agreement?
I don't think there's any doubt about that. And I think this, as Scott has just said, reminds us that there's politics involved on the Korean Peninsula. There always has been. And these international norms are going to be very, very difficult to be enforced as long as China takes that stance. Ambassador,
what is the China's position here? Why is it so reluctant to criticize North Korea's actions?
Well, I think it's because they realize that going after the North Korean regime perhaps risks destabilizing the peninsula in ways that would be very unfortunate for Beijing. I think they also feel that the road to Pyongyang runs through Beijing for the United States, and therefore it gives them more leverage over U.S. policy, certainly in Northeast Asia. So I think that there are a variety of reasons, and one more is their belief in the non-interference in the domestic affairs of foreign countries, and this is one of the international principles that they actually promote, so that people don't look too closely at what the regime is doing inside China itself. So at least in that sense, they're consistent.
Ambassador, just to add to that, do you think the current US-China competition is also affecting China's stance on North Korean issues?
Well, I think that it's certainly not going to be doing the United States any favors anytime soon, but I think it's a broader policy that's, I think, been relatively consistent over the past few decades. They have never brought to bear the pressure that they can leverage over the North Korean regime in terms of food and energy, and I don't expect that they will anytime soon.
Mr. Snyder, the US called out China and Russia for condoning North Korea's sanctions evasion. The State Department spokesperson told VOA that China and Russia are the UN's member states that continue to allow sanctions evasion activities occur within their territories. Why does this keep happening?
Well, again, I think it's really about geopolitics. And in particular, I think that what we've seen is the erosion of a consensus that existed back in 2017 that enabled the Security Council resolutions to be passed. And we see that the Chinese and the Russians have, even though they're on the record as supporting these resolutions, they clearly have been backsliding in terms of enforcement. And I think that it's probably going to remain the case that there is this division, and it's going to hobble the ability to use the Security Council as an instrument to try to put pressure on North Korea.
Mr. Snyder, realistically, is there any possibility that China and Russia will change their stances?
I'm not anticipating any changes, and I think it would be wise for the Biden administration to make policy toward North Korea in such a way that it minimizes any dependence or reliance on China or Russia to achieve the policy's main objectives.
And Ambassador, really, isn't there any possibility that China and Russia will change their mind?
Yes, I think Scott's exactly right. I can't see anything happening in the near or medium-term future that would change the calculations of Moscow or Beijing, and the Biden administration has to accommodate itself accordingly. The most important thing, in my view, has always been maintaining a strong alliance structure with South Korea and Japan. That's really the basis of any policy for stability and security in Northeast Asia for the United States, and we can't let North Korea prevent us from achieving that.
Ambassador, just to add one more question about this, there are so many skeptical views in terms of the UN's role in containing North Korea's nuclear ambitions. Can we expect something out of UN meeting?
It's never a bad thing usually for people to talk about these issues, to raise the profile, to at least highlight at least where the differences are. A lot of it's simply political symbolism at this point, and until there's a consensus among the five veto-bearing members of the Security Council, you're really not going to have a whole lot of collective action. But there are things that the United States and its allies can do in terms of sanctions that hopefully won't be undercut by Russia and China. But that's going to be limited going forward.
And Mr. Snyder, your view?
Well, I'm not expecting much from the Security Council at this stage. I would note that the Security Council discussion also has presented opportunities for European countries to underscore a kind of unanimity of view about the illegality of North Korean actions, despite the outlier views of China and Russia, who unfortunately are veto holders on the Security Council.
And 2 days after the UN Security Council held the emergency meeting, North Korea slammed the Council for applying double standards over its missile tests. Mr. Snyder, what does North Korea mean by double standards?
Well, basically, North Korea does not like being held to account for conducting testing that they think they should be allowed to do and that other countries are allowed to do. And so essentially what they're looking for is acceptance of their program and their testing, despite the fact that it was illegally pursued through violations of the NPT. And they are constantly using the UN in order to express their resentment, especially about U.S. testing as related to missile defense, which is ongoing.
Right. Ambassador, what do you make of what North Korea is claiming? Does this make any sense?
Well, I think that we risk misunderstanding the situation if we think that North Korea is irrational or crazy. Those are not terms that I think apply. So on their own terms, they're trying to get out from under sanctions that hobble the regime, raise the cost of their doing business. And so it's completely logical that they would like to have these constraints removed from their programs. And ultimately, I think they want the world to bless their nuclear weapon status. And so that really, I think, is what their long-term strategic goal is, that they be accepted as another nuclear weapon state. And that, of course, is something that the United States and most other countries around the world are refusing to accept right now.
And the White House spokesperson, Jen Psaki, said right after North Korea's missile test, the U.S. has made specific proposals for discussions with North Koreans, but Pyongyang has not responded so far. Ambassador, why do you think this is the case?
Well, let me just say a couple of things about talking to the North Koreans. First of all, we the United States can always talk to the North Koreans through their UN mission in New York City. That has been a channel that's always open, and it's often been used by administrations, both Republican and Democrat. So the idea that we don't talk to the North Koreans, I think, is a little bit misleading. Rather, I think what people really focused on is having a permanent negotiating process that's relatively routine and standard. And we really haven't been able to sustain that type of engagement with the North Koreans now for many, many years. I do think that the Biden administration has offered to the North Koreans to reconstitute talks, but my understanding is that the North Koreans are insisting on preconditions, that there be sanctions released before these talks begin. So they'd like to pocket some advantages before the talks begin, and then should they begin, I wouldn't expect that they'd lead everywhere, but then the North Koreans would already have sanctions relief. So I think that's what's going on here, is that we're talking past each other at this point.
Ambassador, the United States and South Korea have been discussing ways to provide humanitarian aid to North Korea. Do you think humanitarian aid is not enough to bring North Korea to the table?
Well, I have been pretty consistent in believing that humanitarian aid should be judged on its own merits. It should not be tied to any diplomatic or political initiatives. You know, as President Reagan said years ago, a starving child knows no politics. So there are some preconditions, some conditions in terms of whether or not North Korea merits getting humanitarian assistance. Will it go to the right people? Is there real need? These are the sorts of things that need to be assessed. But I don't believe it should be used as a carrot to entice the North Koreans into a negotiating stance.
Mr. Snyder, going back to North Korea's approach towards the U.S. and South Korea, why are they acting so differently?
Well, I think that the North Koreans have taken a look at the situation since the beginning of the year. They've assessed the Biden administration's approach and the Moon administration's approach. The Biden administration and the president himself have continued to emphasize complete denuclearization as the objective, and they seem much more reticent to provide high-level meetings that would be of prestige value to the North Koreans. And the South Koreans, the Moon administration is continuing to signal willingness to try to engage with the North Koreans as a way of getting something going. And so it makes sense that the North Koreans would shift from an approach that had been focused on symmetry with Trump in the previous administration to an approach that would try to yield gains in terms of inter-Korean engagement, while also trying to magnify some differences between the U.S. and South Korea.
In the meantime, North Korea is moving towards somewhat reconciliatory mood with South Korea. The two Koreas reopened their liaison and military lines. Ambassador, is North Korea preparing itself to resume dialogue with South Korea?
I think North Korea would like to resume dialogue with the South in order to see what concessions it can extract, at least while President Moon is still in office. There are some bilateral things, I suppose, that the South could provide, but the type of big ticket items, the sanctions relief, and certainly acceptance of its nuclear weapon status are gifts that the Blue House can't confer on the North?
Well, I think that the North Koreans are pursuing what I think has been referred to as the Uri Minjok-Kiri strategy. They're trying to look for ways to align with South Korea in order to generate divisions with the United States. The Moon administration is providing potential opportunities to do that. And most notably, we've seen the South Korean foreign minister recently publicly voice desires for sanctions relaxation that have been rejected by the State Department spokesman. And so I think the North Koreans are probably quite pleased to see that there is visible space between the positions of the two governments on that issue.
There are some people in South Korea suspecting that North Korea is trying to intervene in South Korea's presidential election slated next spring. Do you share that view?
Well, we'll have to wait and see. I think we have some months to see how that might develop, and I think that it might be premature to cast it in that way yet, because there probably may be opportunities. North Korea has always been an issue in South Korean politics, the quote-unquote North Wind, Bukpung, and normally it's been the North Korean threat that has been the focus. What's interesting with the Moon administration is now it's actually the North Koreans' conciliation that could be the factor that might intervene in the context of Korean politics.
Ambassador, do you see there's a possibility that North Korea is trying to intervene in South Korea's presidential election?
I think we should expect that they'll try to do so. I think that this would not be the first time that has happened. I'm not sure that it's ever had the desired effect that Pyongyang intends. But the larger point is exactly as Scott said, is that this is really just another attempt to try to divide allies from each other, to create division, to create public mistrust. And again, that's why the underlying basis for any policy towards the Korean Peninsula has to be alliance management, and to make sure that there's as little daylight as possible between the United States, South Korea, and Japan with all things regarding North Korea.
Earlier, South Korean Foreign Minister Chung Eui-yong said Seoul and Washington should consider easing sanctions on North Korea as a way to entice the regime to the talks. The United States rejected such call, saying it is important for the international community to send a strong, unified message that North Korea must hold provocations. Ambassador, what can you tell from the U.S. stance? Is the U.S. still willing to talk to North Korea?
Well, as I said before, I think the United States is always willing, has always been willing to talk to North Korea. As I said, there's always the New York channel at the UN. But as the Biden administration has said, they're willing to talk with no preconditions. I think the problem has been that the North has insisted on preconditions and perhaps getting some South Koreans to carry some of that water for them. The idea that you're going to deliver benefits in order to create the right atmosphere or create trust, I think really is a misunderstanding about how these negotiations take place and whether they're ultimately going to be productive. There has to be mutual interest on both sides. And coming with preconditions or insisting on preconditions is not a good way to start.
Mr. Snyder, the United States maintains the strong stance on sanctions while saying it is open to talks with North Korea. Will the U.S. and North Korea be able to narrow their differences?
Well, I thought the question was going to be, will the U.S. and South Korea narrow their differences? And I think that really has to be the first priority as we try to jointly engage with the North.
Then, Mr. Snyder, what do you expect to happen next? What should be watched very carefully?
Well, it looks like there may be some action on the inter-Korean channel. We'll have to see how that plays out. This is short-term and tactical. The North Koreans have already laid out their strategic objectives from the Eighth Party Congress. They want to pursue nuclear development and militarization. And I think that what is most worrisome is that as we look back at what they said they were going to do in January, we've seen them check a few things off of their list in the last few weeks with the tests. And so what I would be focusing on is what are the other things that they might want to check off on their list that they had advertised back in January.
Mm-hmm. And Ambassador, can I ask for your last thought?
Yeah, I think that the world can expect the North Koreans to continue to develop their military capabilities across the board, to continue to be both provocative and conciliatory towards South Korea, and to continue to hope that the Biden administration will make some unilateral concessions as a way of getting back to the negotiating table. So as Scott said, these are tactical issues. The strategic imperative for the United States is to remain tightly knitted with South Korea and Japan to present a unified front to the North.
Meanwhile, the World Health Organization has started shipping COVID-19 medical supplies into North Korea. And the State Department said the U.S. supports such efforts. At the same time, it stressed the North Korean regime itself is primarily responsible for the humanitarian situation in the country. Ambassador Reiss and Mr. Snyder, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.